Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of podcast. I am your host Neeraj, and today we are diving into something incredibly important and timely: the US presidential election process. With the 2024 election just around the corner or November 5th, I thought this would be a perfect opportunity to break down how the United States chooses its president. Whether you are new to this or just need a refresher, we are going to cover everything from primaries to electoral college and even what happens after election also. And now I get it, the US election system can seem a little confusing, especially when you hear terms like primaries, caucuses, electoral votes, and conventions thrown around. But don't worry, by the end of this episode, you will understand full process and it will all make sense. We'll also look at what's happening right now in 2024 with Kamala Harris running for the Democrats and Donald Trump is for the Republicans. Whether you are following this race closely or not, I will break everything in an easy manner. So let's jump in. First things first, let's get a bird's eye view of how the US election system works. Every 4 years, Americans head to the polls to elect a new president. The election always happens on the first Tuesday of November, which this year is November 5th. But here is where things get a little complicated. The US does not directly elect its president based purely on the popular vote, which is the total number of votes each candidate receives. Instead, the United States uses a system called Electoral College to make the final decision. Now, the election process starts way before election day. It's not like anyone can just decide to run for president out of the blue. A lot of work goes into picking the candidates who will represent two main political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans. This year, the Democrats have chosen Kamala Harris as a presidential candidate over current President Joe Biden. And the Republicans have chosen Donald Trump. But how exactly do these candidates get chosen? That's where the primaries and caucuses comes in. This is the part of the process where each party selects its official nominee for president. We will get into that in just a minute. Before we dive deeper, it's important to understand that the US political structure is based on a federal system, which means it's shared between the national government and the individual state. Each of the 50 states has its own rules of election, which makes things even more interesting and sometimes more confusing also. But at the end of the day, the goal is to select a president who will serve 4 year terms and potentially a second term if re-elected. So let's break down the steps that leads up to the general election. All right, let's start with primaries and caucuses. These are key events that happen in each state and they are the first big step in choosing who will run for president. If you have ever wondered how candidates like Kamala Harris and Donald Trump ended up as the top picks of their parties, this is how it starts. In simple terms, primaries and caucuses are like mini elections that happened within each party. The goal is for the party members to vote for their preferred candidate. This process starts way back in early January of the election year and stretches out over several months, with different states holding their primaries and caucuses at different times. You might have heard of the Iowa caucuses or the New Hampshire primary. These are usually the first events in the race and they get a lot of attention because they can set the tone of the rest of the campaign. So, what's the difference between primary and caucus? In a primary, it's pretty straightforward. People go to the polling places, cast their votes, and that's it. It's just like a regular election, but in a caucuses, things are a little more involved. Instead of just voting, people gather in a meetings, often in schools or community centers, and openly discuss the candidates. After some debates, they vote. But it's more like a big group discussion. Caucuses are less common than primaries, but they are still an important part of the process. Once the votes from these primaries and caucuses are in, each candidate earns delegates, people who represent them at parties, national convention. The number of delegates a candidate gets depends on how many votes they received in each state. The goal for each candidate is to collect enough delegates to win their party's nomination. Now, we have got that covered. Let's move on to the what happens after the primaries and caucuses, the national conventions. Once all the primaries and caucuses are done, the next big step is the national conventions for each party. This is where things really start take shape, and it's the moment where party officially nominates its candidate for president. And the conventions are big events with lots of speeches, celebrations, and most importantly, voting. But who's voting? And why does it matter? Well, remember those delegates we talked about earlier? These are the people who officially vote for the party's nominee at conventions. Each state sends a certain number of delegates based on the results of their primary caucuses. So the candidate who did well in the primaries and collected most delegates will typically win the nomination at the convention. For example, at the 2024 Democratic National Convention, Kamala Harris was officially nominated as the Democratic candidate for the president because she had secured enough delegates during the primaries. Similarly, the Republican National Convention, Donald Trump won the nomination for the Republican Party. Once the nomination is locked in, the convention is also where the candidate announces their running mate, who will be the vice presidential candidate. So, after the conventions, we officially know who is running for president and vice president from each party. The conventions are a huge part of the process because they set the stage for the final phase of the election. The general election. From this point on, it's all about campaigning, debates, and try to win over voters across the country. Now, let's talk about what happens next. The general election. This is when everyone in the country gets to vote for the next president. On election day, which is November 5th this year in 2024, millions of Americans will cast their vote. But here is the catch. It's not just about who gets the most individual votes. The United States uses a system called Electoral College to actually decide who becomes the president. So, what exactly the Electoral College is? Think of it like this. Instead of counting all votes across the country and picking the candidate with most, the United States break it down by states. Each state has a certain number of electoral votes based on its population. For example, big states like California have a 55 electoral votes, while smaller states like Vermont only have 3. And here where it gets interesting, in most states, the candidate who win the popular vote in the state get all of the electoral vote. It means like this is called winners take on system. So even if a candidate win a state by just a tiny margin, they will get all of the state's electoral vote. That's why certain states called swing states are so important. And these are the states that could go either way, Republican or Democrat, and they can make all difference in the final result. That's why swing states are more important and play a key role in US elections. And the goal for the candidate is to win at least 270 electoral votes out of the 538. Once a candidate reaches that number, they have officially won the presidency. But even though election day is on November 5th, the process doesn't end. After the election, the electors in each state meet in December to cast their official vote. Then in January, Congress counts those votes and the winners is formally announced. Finally, the new president takes office on January 20 in a big event called inauguration. So, that's the process, but let's bring it back to the current election in 2024. This year, we have got Kamala Harris running for the Democrats and Donald Trump for Republicans. Both candidates are fighting hard to win those crucial electoral votes, and the race is heating up. The issue in these elections are like everything from healthcare, the economy, the climate change, to foreign policy, immigration. Both Harris and Trump are pushing their ideas and try to convince voters that they have the best plan for the country's future. And remember, it all comes down to swing states, where the race is often the closest. These states can decide who wins. So both campaigns are focusing a lot of their time and resources. And that's it, folks. Now you have got a solid understanding of how the US presidential election process works. From primaries to caucuses to the general election and electoral college. It is a long process with a lot of moving parts, but every steps play a crucial role in selecting the, next president of the United States. As we move closer to the November 5th, keep eye on those swing states and candidates campaign. Thanks for tuning into today's episode. And if you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to subscribe, share, and let others know about the podcast. Stay informed, and we will also see you next time for another deep dive into worlds of the politics and other topics. Thanks for listening.